I'm here to talk about DrumG. I'm here to talk about our latest product, which we're very excited to be going live with in short order with a very exciting group of large financial institutions. And what we really want to talk about is the problem that we're solving. So we've come up with this tagline which represents more of the hero being the industry rather than the hero being the technology. So everybody is excited about emerging technologies, everybody's excited about blockchain, but we really should be getting more excited about the problems that it's going to solve, in particular the collective action problems that it's going to solve. And we believe that we are in a very strong position to provide global financial services with an opportunity to take and reclaim their data back. It's ultimately your data, and you should own it, and you should control it. And our sub-tagline, which is around control and efficiency, is really, really important. So we're going to explain a little bit of how that works. So crucially, what we want to talk about, I want to reiterate, is this notion that it is about the problems you solve, rather than, as often is talked about, the technology. So, and the impact that you generate needs to be measured in something other than just excitement. It needs to be either dollars or it needs to be in progress. And that's what really this project is all about, the measurable advance and the exciting places we can take this. So when we think about putting a product in place, crucially, we feel that you need all the pieces of a puzzle, the three elements of what we call the DrumG Holy Trinity. It's all very well having a technology platform that works, but without an agreement, particularly with collective action problems, on how you're going to govern a network and what the business model is going to be like, and without a commercial model that all the participants will agree to, there is no product, there is no network, there is no future. And so what I'm going to talk you through is how we've managed to pull all of this together. So a couple of points before we move on. The elements that we're trying to leverage here, which I think are quite important, are network-based power law economics. And ultimately, all generally blockchain network solutions or network solutions are multi-sided platforms. You tend to have multiple participants, multiple sides of a market coming together to interact, and the holy grail is the whole value of the ecosystem goes up because of the solution that you build. And they are, and I use this term a lot because I think it's important, collective action problems, and you'll see that we're working with 10 of the biggest banks in the world. That really required a lot of collective collaboration, and you can't do it without it. So moving on, since we are here and we appreciate ConsenSys not only being the hosts for today's event, but also our sole investor, and Joe Lubin is our board member, it's worth just putting up a quote from Joe himself, because we think Joe really understands what we're trying to do at its deepest level. The power of compounding interest, compounding value creation events with minimized delays can be a profound driver of exponential growth. So we're not saying that this titanium network that we're going to show you is going to drive growth in the economy, but it is a piece of the puzzle for getting the power law economics to work and drive value in an ecosystem. So the other thing that we want to say before we show you the product and explain what it is this notion of breaking down silos. And ultimately, I'm going to move to the next slide and show you an important quote from one of our advisors, Professor Gordon Hewitt. Value is generated at the intersection of previously walled gardens. It's sort of the flip side is if you can get everybody together and try and solve a collective action problem, then ultimately you might be able to cross over the barriers that have traditionally existed, and there is value at those barriers. Some of what we're doing here actually kind of lays the groundwork for being able to do that at a very large scale. So next slide. You saw the Albert Einstein quote there, and it's interesting we always say that because it turns out Albert was wrong. And why is he wrong? Because he says that you have to learn the rules of the game and play it better than everybody else. But actually, we're doing something very different here, and I think this is where we start to sort of get from the promise of blockchain and the POCs into actually making a real difference. You got to play the game You got to change the rules, but ultimately, way more fun than that is you got to change the game. But what game? You got to start with a game, and we're going to start with capital markets. But let's put it into context on the next slide. We're going to show you a fun little set of diagrams. So this is the crypto market. I checked this morning; it was 256 billion, depending on where you are in time. The Fed's balance sheet is 4.5 trillion. Global currency market is 7.6 trillion. Global money supply, 127 trillion. Now we're getting into pretty significant size. All the fixed income and equity markets around the world, 185 trillion. But the big kahuna is the OTC derivatives market. So ultimately, there's a lot of excitement about the growing size and the importance of the crypto market. And blockchain, in many respects, really started here, obviously. We're coming at it from over here, the biggest single market that there is. And we'll talk later about the 10 banks that we have and the market share they have in this marketplace. But when we get to that, you'll remember this slide, because we're going to be talking about all the orange boxes. Global capital markets are all the derivatives, all the equities and fixed income instruments, and all the currency trades that there are. That's the scope of what we're dealing with. It's about, if you do the math, $737 trillion in size. It's massive. Okay, great. That's the game that we want to change, but what about it? So data is the new oil is a sort of a term that's been around for a long, long time, but we kind of want to move a little bit past that. That's an easy thing to say, and people talk about storing data and the extraordinary statistics about 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years, things like that. This isn't about the size of the data, it's about what you do with the data. If data is the new oil and is a commodity and it's got value, then it should be treated as something that's got value. So moving on to the next slide, we want to describe a problem, but at a high level, there's a great way to describe this problem that all of us as individuals can understand. If capital markets has a data problem, but actually on the next slide you see that it's not really so much capital markets, it's that we as individuals have a data problem. More specifically, we have a data ownership problem. And the very manifestation of that data ownership problem is, on the next slide, the Facebook, or the Google, or the number of large institutions that have made us all feel uncomfortable as we slowly realized that they were taking our data and they were monetizing it, and we couldn't control it, and we didn't get any kind of economics out of it. It just disappeared, and it made other people wealthy and other companies wealthy. Well, that feeling that we all know and we all understand is actually the same feeling, as you can see from the next slide, that the banks have. Capital markets, institutional players, they have that same feeling of, wait a minute, that data that I had is somehow not mine. I don't control it and I don't monetize it. And actually, Bloomberg and IHS Markit are in many ways the same positioned as Facebook and Google. They're taking that data, and there's plenty of precedent for this, and I think most people in capital markets would recognize this. There are some products that Bloomberg literally can't give away for free because the market doesn't trust that that data that they might give as a part of that service won't end up on the terminal. That's a statement you hear a lot. That's an extraordinary statement around trust for a large institution like Bloomberg. So ultimately, I'm not going to keep talking about trust, but trust is an element of this, and that's what we're going after. So what I want to talk to you about is the Titanium Network. Now we've kind of set it up, but in order to do that, you should hear from the progenitor directly of the Titanium Network. Just over 2 years ago, I got a call from Emmanuel Aidoo at Credit Suisse with an idea. And hey, why don't I let him tell you what the idea was, Emmanuel?
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for inviting me. I was wondering what I was going to talk about, so thanks for setting it up. It really was. It's a funny story, and I'll share it with you. The Titanium Network. So, little known fact: I used to think I was going to be a really good rugby player. I was quite quick when I was in the UK. I live in the US now, And someone who I forget who it was convinced me that I should try out for the Hampstead rugby team. Didn't go very well. I got hit quite badly, broke 3 bones, collarbone and 3 vertebrae. And I limped on with life for about 10 years, moving to the US, until finally I decided to have an operation. And so I had the operation. I've got a few bolts holding my back together. Don't worry, I'm fine. And Tim calls me up to wish me well. And ever the blockchainist, rather than just worrying about getting better, I said, I've got a great idea. And so what had happened was about 3 or 4 weeks earlier, we'd done a hackathon at Credit Suisse. It was a global hackathon. I think I had about 150 or so developers, playing around with the technology, and I had judges in every country. And ultimately, one truism is that my judges weren't very good because the actual the winner wasn't this idea. So second runner-up, I can't remember where he placed, but he comes up to me afterwards, and he's a developer in our product control area. And he explains this challenge that he has, which is that we take OTC derivative prices, we send them into IHC market, they throw out the outliers, calculate the mean, and send it back to us anonymously, sort of thing. And that's how we do our price our book. And he built this thing over the hackathon, not very rudimentary. It certainly wasn't commercial grade, but he built it over the course of 2 days with a small team. And I knew as soon as he told me about the challenge and the problem that he tried to solve using blockchain, that this was something that was ultimately going to be an industry changer, changing the game, to Tim's point. And that was our conversation. The Titanium Network lends its name because I've got titanium bolts holding my spine together, apparently. So that was how we ended up there. And then, one of the rules of the road that rules of the game, to continue with Tim's analogy, was that we knew what we spent on this technology, on this service. We wanted our data back. We knew what we spent, and we imagined that the top 20 dealers were spending about the same type of number. Without sharing our number, let's just say the top 20 dealers, you can guess it when you do a bit of math, about $100 million. So when we spoke to Tim and DrumG, we said, look, what we'd like you to do is we want to make this thing a really easy decision for any bank to make about joining. Make it a no-brainer. Let's make it 90% cheaper than the current, whatever the number is, it's got to be around about 7 figures, low digits. Let's make it 90%. So that's what we did. We agreed that. And, Tim still got both his arms, even though banks literally dragged them off to join, unsurprisingly. And we find ourselves in a really interesting space. We've got a really impactful, exciting real-world use case. I hear that a lot when we describe this particular technology and this particular application. Real-world use case of blockchain and DLT going live. When is it, Tim? Like next year, early Q1, and it'll be the best feeling on earth when I can start standing up on stage and stop the folks that say, well, if blockchain's so good, why hasn't it gone live yet? I get annoyed by that. That was my Saki. I invoked my teenage daughter's voice there. Sorry. She'll thank me for that later. That is actually how she sounds, by the way. So I'm going to be really, really pleased when we say, no, actually, we're in full production with 10 banks. We're looking for others to join, and I'm sure others will when they start hearing about 90% savings in market data. And, the game change will continue. I don't know, you want me to add anything else to that, Tim, but I think where we are today is this service is it connects using APIs. We can envision it using, it plugs in a way in which has low impact, low disruption to the current process. And if anyone was looking for a very easy way to utilize this technology, make a difference to their bottom line, then I don't see any other way to do it in a more kind of less disruptive way to the current process, market and Bloomberg excluded from that statement. Yeah, cool.
Perfect.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. We really appreciate it. So yeah, there you have it. Forever immortalized why the Titanium Network is called the Titanium Network. There are pictures that go with that as well. So, as we were, as Emmanuel was talking, we were going through the slide with the elements that that make the problem come to life. But there's nothing better than hearing directly from the people in the marketplace. So let's start to dig into this Titanium Network. Let's actually see what it does and understand how we solve the problem. So if you bring all the quotes down, actually, and we'll ultimately, rather than just read them all, I'll maybe pick a couple out. But these are from either publicly available comments that have been made out on the interweb, or they've come directly from our participants in our steering committee with our 10 global banks. I think ultimately this notion of things not being flexible the way they are is a big theme. I love that discourages accounting for day-to-day market events, because ultimately actually some of these older processes can take weeks and months to work through, whereas we're in a world where we have to move in real time and react in real time. And improvement in its methodology and its transparency for IB fee industry. So this is actually the industry saying we're not doing it particularly effectively. Even the way in which we do it, never mind the time it takes, is wrong. So we want all of that control back. But my favorite of all time, and I think of our entire company at DrumG, is a managing director from one of the global banks we have, who early in this process literally banged on the table, much to everyone's surprise, because these valuations people are generally not the most sort of energetic people you'll find, and said, we want our data back, and with gusto really kind of set the tone for everything that we're doing. And although everybody immediately, the reason Emmanuel's right that everybody came to the table is because the business case from a cost-saving perspective is so compelling, it's an order of magnitude reduction, so why wouldn't you do it? And if you actually net present value that over a number of years, it's a not insignificant amount of money. But then when everybody realized that this was the opportunity to take the data back, it really kind of crystallized the value in a way that I don't think any of us, and when we talked that very first time, Emmanuel, it wasn't about data ownership, but it's turned out to be that alongside the cost reduction that's really made the difference here. So let's have a little look at how we do this. And we'll click through this. You keep going, actually, and we'll just kind of go through the model. So we don't want to sit here and talk about architecture diagrams and go into too much detail, but it's worth just showing at a high level what it is that we're trying to do. So financial institutions, and this is our architecture, send their data into what we call a cell. So everything we're doing is on Microsoft Azure. That's really important. We're completely cloud-based, which is really interesting because the feedback we're getting as we go through our onboarding processes with all of our 10 banks, which is quite onerous and quite significant, takes a lot of time, is that the cloud-based solutions are really only now starting to be kind of coming through the mainstream in terms of being allowed. Even 2 years ago, we've been told it might have been a bit trickier for us to have a cloud-based solution. So we've kind of solved that problem, not a moment too soon for us, that the cloud is now accepted for extremely sensitive data, which is exactly what this is. So we're on the cloud, we're on Microsoft Azure, and what we want to do is auditably ensure that the data we always know where the data is, and that for the owner of the data, they know where it is, and then they know where it isn't. So in our model, every bank contributor has a cell, as we call it, and their data goes to that cell. Now then that cell connects to the network. And that's where the data comes into the network and is aggregated in some way in a very transparent manner, according to the needs of the industry. And then the aggregated data is sent back to the cell. So this is sort of a very safe and auditable method to ensure that data is secure at all points. Now, there's an interesting evolution of this, which I'll just touch upon, because today, some sharper of you might think, well, you still see the data. How does the data get aggregated? And yes, today DrumG runs what we call the calculation node. We aggregate the data, and so by definition, we are able to see that data. But the real evolution of this would be if we can't even see the data. And remember, we're not looking to own the data, so we're really about providing the service where we just get the data to the right place, not that we own it and see it, not that we have a terminal that we want to put the data onto. There's no endpoint for that with us. So ultimately, we'll use multi-party computation or zero knowledge proofs or some technology in that class to abstract even ourselves from seeing the data. And I think the banks around the table are excited about that, but the banks are also realistic that that technology is not mature enough to actually deploy today. That's why we're not using it today, and anyone who's telling you that it's deployable at scale, we would question that. As soon as it's available, though, we're going to use that and really make this as decentralized as everybody kind of is looking for. So that's the high-level idea. There's an architecture behind it. Let's talk a little bit now about, let's go to the next slide, our partners. So you can't do this alone. We've had to have a very sort of, well, firstly, I should reiterate, the partnership with Credit Suisse now goes 2 years into history. So, boy, that goes quickly in some respects. A very, very strong supporter from the beginning and continues to be a public and strong supporter today. But then we've got 9 global investment banks as well. So we have 10 of the biggest banks in the world, and I'll talk more about what they look like in aggregate in a second. For those of you who are interested in the blockchain part, yes, we are using a blockchain. We don't talk a lot about blockchain because we don't think that's really the point, but we're using Quorum, which has come out of the JP Morgan camp as the Ethereum, enterprise Ethereum-based blockchain that we're using. I mentioned Microsoft Azure, and worth also mentioning ISDA. So the ISDA common domain model is being used in order to harmonize the way in which the marketplace describes underlying assets and trades that go with them. And so we're going to be, when we come online, completely compliant with ISDA common domain model, which is great. So we're actually sort of looking into the future there as well, which will mean that a lot of what we're doing sort of can integrate with other things. So that's our partners. Let's move on to the next slide. And what I'm not going to do is kind of go through this entire demo just to show you something real. This is actually the product working. Now, it's funny, with a lot of these solutions, it's hard to sort of bring them to life because they're really kind of process-driven and they're really underneath the hood. So how can you bring it to life to kind of give you a sense of what it's actually doing? And this is the best that we could come up with. Ultimately, right here, there's blockchain at work. What we've got here at the top is the actual nodes for a couple of banks. So that would be Bank A, that would be Bank B, and in the middle, you've got DrumG's calculation node, and at the bottom you've just got all of this information which actually is live in real time as this network's doing its thing, showing you the blocks being created, information being fed into blocks. This gives you a sense of what the banks are actually sending to us. This is a good example. Some of them still, by the way, do that on a spreadsheet, but the more advanced ones do it by API, so we'll be able to do both. And ultimately, they take that data, they upload it into our system, and ultimately that data is then sent back. Not that complicated. It actually works, and we've actually had it working since last Sibos, last year in October of last year. So now we've gotten to the point where we're actually testing with the banks. We have 10 banks testing, and actually as of yesterday, we finally got to a point where we're working with real live data. So not test data, actually live data for the FX market, which incidentally is the market that we chose to go into first. There's a lot of asset classes, fixed income, commodities, equities, etc. We started with FX because you can actually do a lot in that marketplace, especially when you have 53% of the market share, as we do with the 10 banks that we have. So going on to the next slide, let's finish off by talking just at a high level why this whole thing's disruptive at all. Daily and month-long processes become instantaneous. Centralized market data control becomes controlled by the users and the progenitors of the data. The vendor, the incumbents, monetize the data. Well, now the user monetizes the data. The contributors get to monetize the data. Manual price challenges become automated. Expensive lock-in monopolies completely go away, and there's an order of magnitude cost saving and flexibility, and black box calculations that we just had no visibility into suddenly become transparent. So that's really actually something that can be expanded more broadly beyond this specific use case. Move on to the next slide. So let's just give you a sense of the scale of what we're doing now that you can see the problem we're solving. 10 of the world's largest banks, accounting for 40% of all global capital markets, which is an extraordinary number, and representing 53% of the global FX market where we're starting, which, for reference, trades $6.6 trillion of volume per day, and we're going to be pricing that entire market, which is very, very exciting. For reference, the crypto market tends to trade about 10,000 times less than that. So, next slide. The last piece of the puzzle is, this is great fun, and I think we're going to change the game, but it's really much more fun if you can then continue to do more. And actually, all these use cases that you see on here are moving into real traded prices, FRTB-related use cases, very regulatory-driven use cases, but there are so many that we've thought of, and our banks are telling us all the time new ones. The direction we can go in with this is really quite extraordinary. We're only just getting started, and once we've got this network, we can move forward from there. So with that, it's your data. You should own it. Hopefully, we've brought that to life in this session. You can understand why control, ownership, efficiency, access, and trust is what we're in the business of doing. And ultimately, DrumG is about our grand ambition, big impact, small step. Turns out small step number one is titanium. Thank you very much.